This is our discussion of animals in sustainable agriculture for the agroecology class. You probably hear a lot of negative things about livestock, including climate impact, animal welfare, use of pharmaceuticals, but I would like for us to talk about the role of animals in sustainable ag, especially regarding carbon and diversity. Animals can enhance agroecosystems depending on how they're raised. I think it's important first to ask a number of questions, such as, why do we raise animals? Across the world, animals are raised for high protein, for meat, milk, and eggs, fiber, but they're also raised for work, draft, tillage, for example, and for their fertility, for manure. I think we should also ask, why do we eat meat? In the US, I would say that we eat meat because we like it and because it is culturally appropriate for much of the US. For example, in North Carolina, barbecue is culturally appropriate for us. But basically, we don't have to eat meat because we can get all of our protein from plant sources, but we eat it because we like it. We do need to understand how animals are raised commercially in the US, and that's one thing we'll talk about during our discussion. They're often raised inside in crates or cages or on the floor, on slats or litter, but they're often raised outside in feedlots or on pasture. How do we raise livestock sustainably? This is what we'll discuss in our presentation today, and a lot of it depends on how we feed our livestock. Is it ethical to raise animals for human use? This is a question that depends on your perspective. You may believe that it's not ethical to raise animals for human use, and therefore the discussion is fairly short for this question. But for those who believe it's ethical to raise animals for human use, then it's important that they be raised in a responsible way. As I mentioned, in some places, livestock are too valuable to eat for meat. Their milk, eggs, fiber, their work is too valuable to eat them. And in many cases, livestock may be working animals for us, such as this herd dog. Animals are a key part of nature in natural ecosystems. They enable energy flow and they also enable nutrient cycling from plants because they ingest plants, they digest it, they defecate and decompose the organic matter. Herbivores and grasslands evolved together in nature and they need each other. We've discussed earlier in the semester that in areas that are very arid, animals are needed because the bacteria to break down decomposition can't really work very well without water because it's too dry. And then animals are also needed for diversity. The major grasslands of the world in North America includes the prairies in our prairie states. In South America, the pampas are an important grassland. In Eurasia, the steppes. South Africa, the veld, and in Australia, the outback. These areas are very important for carbon sequestration. Grasslands sequester a lot of carbon, and they need to be stewarded, and actually grazing animals can steward these areas because they need to be grazed. Animals in agroecosystems produce, as we know, food, fiber, and a very high quality protein. They also provide work, and that might be draft, such as draft horses or oxen, or it may be other types of services such as weed control. They also provide manure. They provide fertility. And animals eat things that humans cannot, So when we look at sustainability, we're going to be looking at feeding grazing animals. They need to eat forage. And then our monogastrics, we'll talk more about what monogastrics are, but pigs and poultry need to eat things that we can't eat if we're going to maximize sustainability. It's important to know what a ruminant is. We'll be talking about ruminants and monogastrics. A ruminant, like cattle, they do have a specialized gastrointestinal tract. And the rumen is basically like a 50-gallon fermentation vat. In dairy cattle, for example, this can be very large. And the rumen is where the microbes live, and the microbes break down forage. So herbivores, like ruminants, they have a gastrointestinal tract that's designed for complex forage feeds. And it does involve regurgitation. The animal eats forage and the bolus goes down the esophagus to the rumen, and you can see that it comes back up because forage is a complex feed and it needs to be chewed very well. So that's what chewing the cud is. The animal regurgitates and is able to chew this up more before it passes on to other parts of the gastrointestinal tract. The omasum, which is the more like a filter, and the abomasum, which is the true glandular stomach. And just like ours, then the digestion proceeds to the small intestine and the large intestine. Herbivores include ruminants, and in this case, the rumen, where the fermentation takes place, is in the forepart of the gut in front of the abomasum. In other types of non-ruminant herbivores, such as horses, the fermentation takes place in the hindgut after the true stomach, and it takes place in the colon or in some cases in the cecum. Ruminant herbivores include cattle, sheep, and goats, and again they have a specialized multi-compartment GI tract. It's often called a four-part stomach. The microbes live in the rumen, and this is what allows cattle to eat forage, to eat the fiber, digest the fiber in the forage. The microbes digest the cellulose, but they actually produce methane as a natural byproduct. And this is produced by eructation, which is belching. It's not flatulence from the hind end, it's eructation from the foregut. This gas does need to escape from the animal, and it is a byproduct. Keep in mind that this is an incredible mutualism that allows the microbes to digest the fiber in forage. I tend to think of forage as being a renewable energy resource because it comes from the sun and from photosynthesis. But the other side of that is the methane production. In contrast, a monogastric includes pigs, poultry, and humans. And this is a GI tract that's designed for concentrated feeds that are easy to digest. So that includes seeds, pulses, and grains. And you can see what the GI tract looks like in swine and actually in humans too. What you're familiar with, the stomach where food is stored, and then the small intestine. The swine have a large cecum. Compared to humans, we just have a little tiny appendix that's not really very functional. But the cecum, there's a little bit of fermentation that takes place of forage in the cecum, and then it goes on to the large intestine. In the U.S., crops and animals have specialized. They're no longer raised together. They're no longer integrated on diversified farms. In fact, a word that we can use is disintegrated. They're no longer together. Manure is produced in large amounts in concentrated animal feeding operations. Manure used to be considered an asset to fertilize crops, but at times in large feeding operations, it's actually considered a liability because there's just too much of it. So concentrated animal feeding operations, or they're commonly called CAFOs, these are much like the monoculture of crops. We do see a geographical concentration of CAFOs, of animal feeding operations. For example, broilers are concentrated geographically in the southern U.S. Hogs used to be concentrated mainly in the Midwest, where there's a lot of grain, but in the 80s, we started seeing a lot of hog operations move to southern states, actually to North Carolina. In fact, so much that a moratorium had to be put on large-scale hog farms in the early 90s. Cattle feedlots are generally in the Midwest, in the Plains states. It's important to know how animals are raised in the U.S. commercially, on an industrial scale. And we need to look across species. We need to look at poultry, meat chickens, layers, of course, lay eggs. With piglets, they're produced by sows, and the piglets grow up and become hogs. And then dairy production, dairy cattle, and beef cattle are very important industries in the U.S. I'd like for us to look at this by production system, feed, and routine pharmaceuticals that are used to help you understand how animals are raised in the U.S. Meat chickens, it is confined housing. They're raised on litter on the floor. Layers are raised in cages. Piglets are raised in intensive confined housing on the floor, on plastic slats or on concrete. Their mothers, sows, are raised in a crate, a gestation crate. But this is starting to change. Dairy, the animals, cattle are raised in a dry lot, which is much like a feedlot for finishing for beef cattle. But keep in mind, the calves are raised on pasture and grassland, rangeland all over the country. So the most intensive type of production is layers and sows. And again, it's starting to change now. Layers are being raised much more in cage-free housing. That's not necessarily free range, but it is cage-free, so they're not confined to a cage. And more companies are starting to allow their sows to be group housed instead of housed only in crates. The crates, a gestational crate, is meant to protect the sow during pregnancy so other sows don't bump into her and mess up the pregnancy. And then a farrowing crate is used to prevent her from accidentally crushing the piglets while they nurse. But there are some very good methods of group housing for sows. Feed is generally corn and soybeans for all species, especially our poultry and our pigs. Dairy and beef cattle, they are ruminants, so they are fed some silage and hay along with corn, and they're also fed some byproducts. It's important to know what type of pharmaceuticals are typically used in industrial livestock production. I think you've heard a lot about antibiotics and hormones, for example. And antibiotics have typically been fed to our livestock for a long period of time because it does encourage faster growth. But we're seeing a major change with the meat chicken industry now that increasingly they're raised antibiotic-free. At least half of our chickens are raised without antibiotics. And this is, I'm not sure that the hog industry has quite caught up to the poultry industry on this. Poultry are not fed hormones. People often worry that they're fed hormones, but they're not. They haven't ever really been fed hormones. They actually grow fast enough from genetic selection without needing hormones. So they're not fed to meat chickens. Layers are not given antibiotics or hormones. We eat eggs. They're laid every day by chickens, and it's not legal to feed antibiotics to chickens. If they're laying eggs, there has to be a withdrawal period. So antibiotics are still used some with hog and sow production, but hormones are not fed to swine in the U.S. Dairy, again, much like layers, we drink their milk, they produce milk every day. So if they need to be treated with antibiotics for a disease such as mastitis, there's a withdrawal period, and it's illegal to sell milk that has antibiotic residue in it. Every batch of milk is tested for that. Hormones are fed to beef cattle at the feedlot. Well, it's not fed to them. They receive hormones by an implant in their ear. So that does make them grow faster. So if you're interested in natural beef, that's raised without hormones. But most of our beef animals do receive hormone implants and then some antibiotics at the feedlot. Many people are also concerned about animal welfare. So I do want to point out that our main legislation in the U.S. is the Humane Slaughter Act. That applies to all species except poultry, and livestock should be insensible at the time of kill. This is what the Humane Slaughter Act is. So that protects our animals from pain during slaughter. We don't have much other federal legislation for animal welfare for farm animals in the U.S., but the industry does have welfare standards to do business. But keep in mind, third-party certification programs are very important for animal welfare assurance, and it's a third party such as the Animal Humane Association that certifies that animals are raised with welfare standards. And the states are beginning to regulate. There are a number of states that don't allow layers to be caged or sows to be in gestational crates. This is something that's starting to change. So if we're going to improve sustainability of animal production in the U.S., we need to look at feeding. And that means that ruminants should be raised on forage instead of corn. So that means pasture in many parts of the U.S., it means grasslands, and in very arid areas it might mean range. Range, this is where pastoralists can often raise grazing animals in some of the harshest, most arid environments on Earth, in places where crops can't grow. So pastoralists allow their animals in arid areas to roam and to seek out deep-rooted perennial plants for forage, and also annuals when there are a certain, a little bit of rain, annuals will sprout. So this is how people raise animals and raise food in very arid environments. Grasslands, some of the semi-arid areas, animals are very important for stewardship and grazing our grasslands. They've evolved together. In more humid areas, this is where we have lush vegetative pasture, and rotational grazing is important to maintain good forage and allow it to recover over time. Animals are often pinpointed for using a lot of water, and keep in mind, if you're raising cattle on lush pasture, it's about 75% water, and they will return a lot of that water to the hydrological system from urine. To increase sustainability of livestock, it's also important to reintegrate livestock with crops on diversified farms. That means raising animals and crops together on the same farm or right in the same region, because the animal manure fertilizes the crops. So this is key for diversified farms, and there's many examples of integrated crop and livestock production. At the SD farm, for example, we do raise crops and livestock. Or poultry are typically raised in our cattle pasture, and we do feed poultry and pigs at the SD farm. We do feed them some of the byproducts from the farm, such as cull vegetables. Another interesting agroforestry system is raising swine in woodland areas, particularly with acorn production. And in the U.S. it used to be chestnut production, but we don't have our chestnut trees anymore. But The Iberian ham is well known across the world for hogs that are actually finished on acorns. This is free fat and energy that falls to the ground, and the hogs can eat the acorns, and it's a monounsaturated fat, so it's very healthy fat. If we look at how to increase the sustainability of monogastric or simple stomached animals such as pigs and poultry, we do need to look closely at their feed. Monogastrics in the U.S. are typically raised on feed grains, and we know that corn, soybeans in the U.S. that's typically raised with fossil fuels. So that's a concern for global warming. Also, arable land is limited for crop production, and we know from the energy pyramid that it's more efficient to feed grains directly to people instead of running it through livestock. So it's important to look at how to feed monogastrics sustainably. And pigs and poultry will eat things that humans don't eat, such as crop byproducts, beet pulp, for example, from sugar beets, cull vegetables, see pigs eating pumpkins here, and even food scraps. But it's not legal, because it's often not clean, to feed food scraps to swine, for example. So it would have to be heat treated to feed food scraps. But you can actually convert food scraps to a high quality protein with insect production, with insect biomass. And that's one of the focus of my trials, my research at the farm, is trying to feed black soldier fly to poultry, black soldier fly from feed grade residue from campus. So these are my pastured poultry pens in research at the SD farm. To look closely at ecological sustainability of livestock, we've already discussed in the diversity topics in our class that animals are important to add diversity and provide more interactions and mutualisms. They also, high diversity provides better resource utilization. And animals are part of successionally developed systems. Just like trees and perennials, animals go beyond annual cropping. And animals do not add new carbon to the environment. We'll look more closely at carbon cycling, but they use the carbon that's fixed currently by plants in the atmosphere, so they don't actually add new carbon. And grasslands, as we've said, they're very important, almost as important as forests, to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. That's what regenerative grazing is, and we've looked at a couple of videos at that in more detail. However, we know that ruminants produce methane naturally from their digestion. So this is a concern. If we look at grazing animals in particular, we know that they help sequester carbon. So let's look again at the carbon cycle. That we've used the same diagram throughout the course. This is what we studied in the beginning part of the semester, looking at how atmospheric carbon is fixed by plants and provides energy, fuel, and organic matter. So in our old diagrams, we just looked at a box that said, this is where green plants fix carbon and this is where herbivores eat them. But with grazing animals, let's think a little more closely about that animals graze the forage and it continues the carbon cycle because their waste or their death, that's part of the organic matter. And we know that can be stored in the soil. Over time there is decay. We hope we don't see it go this route with fossil fuels over geological time. But one of the problems is that a lot of that carbon is going to be returned to the atmosphere because of fermentation. It's going to be returned in the form of methane. So there is a balance between, okay, how much is fixed by plants in pastures, and then how much of that carbon ends up through natural eructation returning to the atmosphere in the form of a even more powerful greenhouse gas, methane. So that is a concern. monogastrics, they're also important in regenerative agriculture because they enable the nutrient cycle and they enable energy flow. So let's look at the same carbon cycle. We know that this is how the cycle works, just like with ruminants. But what's different with chickens, for example, and we're looking at a laying hen here, that the carbon is fixed in photosynthesis by corn, and the cycle continues with the waste of the chicken with the manure. But we know our arable land is limited, and humans could be eating this corn more efficiently than sending it through chickens. So, or sending it through other livestock. So it's very important, if we look at regenerative livestock monogastric production, that we know how much manure is produced, and we limit our monogastric production to the manure that's needed for feed crops. And I believe feeding the chickens something else beside the corn that could go to humans. There are also many social and economic benefits to raising livestock. For example, diversifying enterprises. So if one of your crops fails, like if your tomato crop fails, you still may have eggs to sell. You still may have livestock that you could sell. This is particularly important in developing countries. Livestock can help alleviate poverty, and we do know that poverty is the main source, the underlying source of hunger in many countries. So livestock can help pull people out of poverty and can also help promote gender equity and other types of equity. For example, women often raise livestock in many countries. There are many social concerns that we need to look at in animal agriculture, and agriculture in general. We'll be looking at this in the last few weeks of the semester. Keep in mind that the animal agriculture industry is very powerful, and vertical integration can concentrate power in the hands of a few. And the way this happens, vertical integration, is when a company, an integrated company, owns many of the stages of production. With poultry, it may be the genetics, it may be the feed mill, it may be the processing plant, the breeders, and the part that independent farmers often do is they do contract growing of the animals. So it's important for the contract growers actually to have more of a voice in integrated industry, and that's one thing we see. For example, in our state, there's an organization, RAFI, that works with contract growers, trying to help them with their contracts and ensure more equity. Under Contract is a film that was made in North Carolina. So producers do need equitable livelihoods. This is very important. And then consumers, people, need equal access to healthy food. And this should be supported not only by consumers, but it should be supported by our communities, and government policy is needed. This is an example of contract poultry growing. And then there's also many issues in our state, in North Carolina, with swine production. And many times things like some of the issues like odor with swine production end up impacting minorities and people of color more. Other key issues that we're looking at now do include animals and human pathogens with the coronavirus. So most human pathogens are zoonotic, meaning that they do come from animals, but we're starting to see particularly some emerging diseases from animals that do have a lot of pandemic potential, like HIV 20 years ago, that came from wildlife, from simians. Avian flu, we're starting to see more novel types of influenza, avian, swine flu, and then SARS, MERS is from camels, and of course the COVID-19. So these pandemics are not isolated events. We start to see a pattern that Our natural areas, our forests are cut down, and humans do interface more with previously isolated populations of pathogens, and these pathogens can spill over more into our urban areas where we have dense human populations. And industrial livestock production is coming under more scrutiny with this due to the density and large numbers of poultry or swine that provide additional hosts for virus and perhaps help the virus to evolve more and even spread, particularly with hosts that are genetically similar, which our poultry and swine in large-scale production are very similar. This is the equivalent to the need for crop rotation in crops. It's something that we've talked about all semester, that you rotate your crops. You don't grow broccoli in the same place every year because you want to confuse your pest. And this is true with pathogens too, that species and genetic diversity, much like crop rotation, it's needed to slow down pathogen evolution and spread. And natural genetic diversity really puts the brakes on. It's kind of a fire brake for pathogen and pest development. So some of the solutions here are to better connect ecology and our economic needs. We know that nature is self-regulating, and so we need to make sure that we're keeping a lot of our natural areas. We also need to, with livestock, we need to breed them for their fitness to the environment, for their fitness, ability to handle pathogens in their area, instead of bringing in uniform genetics from the outside that have been bred for high yield. Environmental fitness is actually very important. We need to see sustainable agriculture systems and diversified farms, and landscape diversity across all of our landscapes. Many of our landscapes are going to be artificial human landscapes because we do live in cities. 80% of the world's population will be living in cities in the next few years. But we also have human-modified landscapes, our agroecosystems, for example, and these also need to be diversified and provide some of the ecosystem services. And then we definitely need to keep our natural landscapes in place because they are key for providing ecosystem services and hopefully helping us prevent the development of pandemics in the future. The last part that I want to discuss is sustainable consumption of livestock. We've talked about what sustainable production is, but let's look at the other side of that in terms of consumption. In economically developed countries, responsible consumption is needed. In fact, in the U.S., we get a lot of our protein from animal products, and we don't need as much protein as we consume. Adults only need about 11% protein. So we can reduce our animal products, especially from concentrated feeding operations. We can reduce our protein overall from animal products. However, in developing countries, people probably need to eat more protein from animals. Animals are key to provide work, fertility, and then a very high quality, nutritious protein. Responsible livestock production can also help maintain our ecosystem services across the world. Regenerative grazing is possible as long as we don't produce too much methane, and we can reduce it in the U.S., and if we reduce our fossil fuels for grain production, we can also reduce monogastric. We can also reduce carbon from and regenerative. We can increase regenerative farming with our pigs and poultry. Diversity is key, and we've seen that animals are a very important part of agriculture and very important actually in helping us maintain the diversity, much like nature. This is the end of our discussion.